All right. Thank you for joining us for the third Louisiana Brownfield Conference webinar. My name is Rebecca Oddie, and I'm the Brownfield Coordinator at the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality. I'm really excited about this last webinar in our series on underground storage tank. This is another one that really highlights how different divisions at LDEQ work together to facilitate the reuse of vacant and abandoned sites. Today we're going to hear from Sam Broussard and Tad Loop in our underground storage tank division, and Jennifer Schatzel, LDEQ's Brownfield Technical Liaison, on resources to tackle underground storage tanks, which are a common brownfield environmental concern. So before we start, so a few webinar logistics before we start. The webinars are being recorded. We're so far 2 for 2, and the first 2 webinars have been posted along with the PowerPoints onto LDEQ's YouTube page. The recording is up above, and if you go into the comment section, there are links to the PowerPoints underneath. And this one will be posted hopefully within a week. Everyone is on mute for the presentation portion of the webinar. If you have a question, go ahead and type your question into that Q&A box as the chat has been disabled, and we'll go over that in just a minute. So here we go. So if you're looking at your screen, if you look at the bottom, the chat's been disabled, so you won't be able to use that for this webinar. If you do have a question, just type that into the Q&A and we'll make sure to get to it by the end of the webinar. At the very end, we'll open it up for questions, and that's where you can raise your hand, and then I can unmute you if you would prefer to ask your question verbally. All right. And with that, we're gonna, now that we have the logistics out of the way, I'd like to introduce you to today's speakers. Today, we're gonna hear from 2 members of the LDEQ UST division, Sam Broussard and Tad Loop, and then we'll also hear from Jennifer Schatzel. So Sam works as a senior scientist for LDEQ's underground storage tank division, where he develops UST regulations and program guidance, trains UST staff, contractors, owners, and operators on UST compliance issues, and is the LDEQ contact for all Energy Policy Act requirements. With a bachelor's degree in geology from the University of Southwestern Louisiana, he worked in oil and gas industry prior to joining LDEQ in 1992, and has 10 years of RCRA hazardous waste experience and 20 years of UST experience. So lots of experience to draw from, including as the Louisiana State on-scene coordinator for the Deepwater Horizon BP spill from 2010 to 2014. So Sam completed a major revision of the Louisiana UST regulations in September 2018. So you know he knows them inside and out. He worked with UST owners and operators, contractors, trade groups, industry professionals when revising those UST regulations, and he was able to promulgate them with no comment. So any of you who have ever been through any kind of regulation promulgating process, you know what an accomplishment that is. In his spare time, Sam loves to duck hunt with his daughter and his grandkids, and he enjoys his annual trips out west to hunt deer, turkey, and pheasant. Next, we'll hear from Tad Loop, who is a senior environmental scientist with LDEQ's underground storage tank division. He earned a Bachelor of Science degree in soil science from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. After graduation, Tad worked for an environmental laboratory as a metals analyst supervisor, and then he was briefly employed by a hazardous material emergency response contractor. Tad joined LDEQ in 1998 as an environmental specialist in the water quality division, where he began his career conducting water discharge permit inspections, managing oil spill responses, and sampling state ambient water quality watershed basins. In 1999, he transitioned into the underground storage tank program, conducting compliance, installation, and tank closure inspections while functioning as the multimedia inspector in the LDEQ surveillance division. He has 13 years of UST experience related do investigations, recap evaluations, and corrective actions. In 2019, he began serving as the UST Environmental Scientist Senior, focusing on remediation issues. He's a member of the Motor Fuels Trust Fund Remediation Oversight Group and the Underground Storage Tank, Abandoned Tank Closure and Assessment Program Manager. And that's what he's going to talk about today. So he'll give you more explanation on what those involve. In his free time, Tad enjoys boating, fishing, reading, and traveling. The most rewarding part of his work at DEQ is being a member of the Remediation Oversight Group, and that's comprised of senior level staff that's tasked with reviewing and approving high-cost corrective action plans and trying to figure out the most effective technology to remediate sites. And just a side note on coordinating brownfields with underground storage tank program. Sometime last year, EPA asked us to do a presentation on how we partner together. So I asked around at DEQ, found out that Tad was one of the contacts for the UST program, especially the abandoned tank program. And someone said, you know, Tad's in the kitchen, right? So I went in the kitchen, he sat with me for a while, you know, introduced myself, and we sat and chatted and talked about the resources that the UST program has and how we can partner with Brownfields. So he not only knows his stuff, but he's also happy to share that information. And same with Sam. You know, when we were putting this together, someone said Sam would be a great speaker, called him up. He was more than happy to partner with us on this. So I went back to EPA and I said, well, that's going to be a pretty short presentation because our coordination is either I go into the kitchen and talk with Tad or I just pick up the phone and talk with Sam. They're both really easy to access. So that's one of the great things we have in Louisiana is within the Department of Environmental Quality, a lot of the programs are more than happy to help out the other programs. So that's great. Finally, we're going to hear again from Jennifer Schatzel. She's the Brownfields and Voluntary Remediation Program Technical Liaison. As I mentioned on the first webinar on asbestos, Jen brings a wealth of experience to DEQ's Brownfield program with over 15 years conducting and overseeing a variety of Brownfield and VRP projects, including the Lincoln Theater in Baton Rouge, the West Wego City Hall site, definitely had underground tanks there, and Wallace Community Center in Raceland. In her role as LDEQ's Brownfield Technical Liaison, she provides technical assistance and oversight to state and local brownfield projects and assists sites through the voluntary remediation program process. She has a vast background in navigating EPA funding requirements. She's a great resource for you brownfield grantees out there, as well as has extensive knowledge of LDEQ's Risk Evaluation Corrective Action Program and the VRP. She's also worked on more than a few sites that have dealt with USTs. And as I mentioned before, she knows quite a bit, and what she doesn't know, she will find out. In her spare time, Jen enjoys fishing for bream and catfish at her camp on False River, or just pretending to fish and enjoying wine on the patio, which I think sounds lovely, especially now. Before I hand things over to Sam to start us off, I just want to remind you that this is just a start of the conversation. We don't anticipate that you will be UST experts by the end of this webinar, or that you're going to retain absolutely every bit of information. So absorb as much information as you can today. Definitely type your questions into that Q&A box, and then feel free to contact us afterwards if you have any additional questions. And with that, Sam, would you like to get us started?
Sure thing, ready to go.
All right.
Okay, guys. While I set this up, I will clarify one thing. I don't just work and hunt. I also like to cook. I like to go to jam band concerts. Just didn't want you guys to think I was, you know, two-dimensional. So I'm going to have the Q&A screen up on my other computer, and if you have questions, I can answer them as we go, or you could wait until the end. It's totally up to you guys, but if you type them in there, I'll see them and I'll try and answer them if it's the right time. So what I'm going to talk about is underground tanks you found at your Brownfields sites. So a couple of folks have said they found a few, and it's not uncommon. So what I'm going to talk about is I'll start off with, how do you find a UST? How do you know if there's one there? So obviously the first thing you can do is hire an environmental consultant to do a phase 1 site assessment or review paperwork for you, but I'm not going to talk about that. You guys should know that thing. I'm going to talk about other ways, how you could do it, ways to do it yourself. So using our EDMS, which is our electronic data management system, and then also, visual evidence, you find them at your site. So if you want to do EDMS, I'll walk you through that real quick. You go to our main web page, which is deq.louisiana.gov, and you would scroll down and click the big blue box that says EDMS. And then you'll have to type in a disclaimer thing, and then you'll get the EDMS screen. Yeah, Tess, Warren Haynes is the bomb. I appreciate that. So, and I've seen Warren Haynes and Government Mule a bunch of times live. So, so if you know the agency interest number of the site you're at, which would be, you would put it in this AI box. And then the best thing to do is click on the media and click on underground storage tanks and hit run. But if you don't know the agency interest number, you can actually click this lookup AI. Not sure if you could see my cursor circling that. And then you would get you could either type in a name, but I find it's easier to type in an address. So in this case, this site is 1808 South 5th. You may not know how South is typed, so it could be an S or it could be South typed out. So I just normally put an asterisk next to, right after the number, and then type in the street, hit run, and then you'll see a list of all the sites that were at that address. If you want to expand it out, you can just type Leesville, and everything in Leesville will show up. So then you find the one you want and you click the button and return to documents, and then everything we have in everything you have in EDMS for that site will show up. So someone asked if we need to set up an account to access EDMS, and I don't think so. But if that's not the correct answer, then Rebecca may be able to clarify that afterwards. All right, so when you're looking at, if you see a media underground tanks, that means there were probably a tank at that site at one time. So you will want to look for, if you see a UST certificate with the date like 2020/2021, that means it's a currently registered tank. You may see some older ones. If you see a closure assessment form, that means that some tanks were there, but they're permanently closed. You may see in this, like this one, it has status of tanks changed to deferred, which means that there are tanks there and we deferred them. We're not going to regulate them for certain reasons, and I'll explain some of those reasons a little bit later on. And then if you want the details of each document, you just click on under the document ID, you click the green numbers, and then everything in that document will open up for you. All right, so that's EDMS, quick and dirty EDMS. Next thing is just visual evidence when you're at the site. So you might find dispensers, you might see some vent lines, some fill ports, or you might find something while you're excavating. So I'm gonna go through those real quick. So, if you see dispensers, normal gas dispensers, and you know that they didn't have any above ground tanks at the site that were feeding those, and you probably have some underground tanks either there, or normally if the dispensers are there, the tanks are still there. You might find some other oddball looking dispensers that don't look like your normal things. So, you know, don't be surprised you see something with a hose and a nozzle. It's probably connected to a tank. Oh, you might find a loading rack, an old loading rack, or with, you know, you may see the pipe sticking out. You may just see the old loading rack. Some of these were connected to ASTs, but a lot were fed by underground tanks. And then next thing you'll look for, and you might find fill ports. I mean, obviously you see this kind of site, you know, that's a UST site. The fill ports are the areas that where the truck drops product into the tank. Normally on these older sites, you'll find them elevated with a metal cap over them. You might find just some old spill buckets sticking out the ground. If you see that with some vent lines next to it, you know you obviously have an underground tank. You might find some of these really old, just a pipe sticking out of fill port. Again, this one has a vent, so it's kind of obvious. You might find just a whole bunch of small little fill ports scattered around in the field. So that would be an indication that you have tanks there. And you might find sometimes it's hard to find these old style fill ports. Sometimes they're close to the ground. Sometimes they're underneath a shell. Sometimes they're in the grass. It's a good idea if you're just surveying a site to use a metal detector maybe and help you find some of these kind of things. But that's what we're talking about. You find these kind of fill ports, it's good evidence you have an underground storage tank there. And then, of course, the vent lines, you know, that's a good sign that you have tanks. Usually you see them popping up out of the ground, but occasionally you'll see them on top of a building. They're not really in a conspicuous area. So you do have to kind of investigate the site and look around. Let's see. So also when you're excavating, when you start doing your dirt work, you might hit some metal piping, or you might hit some fiberglass piping. Very often that's an indication that those were tied to an underground storage tank. Not always. They could be tied to above ground tanks, but it's a good idea if you do find them, try and follow them back and see if they are connected to a tank. A lot of times while you're excavating, you'll actually hit the tank itself. That's very, very common. We see that a lot. And then usually when you start finding one, you start digging and you find others. So it's not uncommon to find a whole bunch of tanks. It's especially in the olden days, they buried them a little bit deeper and they were a little smaller, and it was easy to just move on top or a little bit to the side and install another one. So a lot of times you'll remove one and you dig a little deeper and you might find a couple other smaller ones. And of course, this is 2020. So if you start finding some drums of things that might smell like hazardous waste or paint waste or some crazy chemical, then it's probably, this is going to be out of the scope of what I'm going to talk about, but you need to call our single point of contact and let us know about that. So so you found the tank. Now, next step. Is it something that DEQ is going to regulate or not? So here's a list of things we don't. So if you have tanks under 110 gallons, we won't regulate it. If you have, we call them equipment use tanks. That would be a hydraulic lift or electrical equipment, some piece of equipment that has a tank built into it. We're not going to regulate those as underground tanks. If you find a tank that's under 1,100 gallons and it is at a farm or a residence, that's not regulated by us. Heating oil tanks or tanks that supplied products to heaters. It could be old hospitals with boilers, things like that. Those are excluded from our regulations. Wastewater treatment tanks, old sumps, things like that are not regulated. LPG tanks, anything like propane, liquefied petroleum gas, something that is not a liquid under standard temperature and pressure are not regulated. And of course, hazardous waste tanks that contain hazardous waste they're regulated, but by the Hazardous Waste Division. So let me clarify though, these are not regulated by the Underground Tank Division. You may find contamination from a hydraulic lift or from a wastewater treatment tank. Those would be dealt with as just a normal solid waste cleanup. So once you determine if it's non-exempt, so any non-exempt tank that contains a regulated substance is what we regulate. And then, you know, that's your normal things: gasoline, diesel, oil, used oil, new oil, motor fuel blends, you know, there's a lot of those nowadays, biodiesel and ethanol blends, anything that's blended with petroleum. And of course, not hazardous waste, but hazardous substances, things like Varsol, petroleum naphtha, antifreeze, things like that. That's a hazardous substance, but not really motor fuel. We do regulate those under US tanks. So the answer to who regulates tanks not regulated by UST, and really the answer is no one. They don't regulate the tanks themselves, they just regulate the cleanup if they leaked. So a couple of other things. So this is another, so after you determine you have a tank, then you need to go through these steps, and I'm going to outline, I'm going to talk about them a little later, and I'm going to explain why they're important. You need to make a determination of, are they registered? And to find that out, again, go to EDMS, do an EDMS search. You can help. If you can't find it, you could do a public records request, or you can easier just to call our regional office. We'll look it up for you. When were they last used? And now that that's an important piece of information you're going to need. If you can't find it in EDMS, we always recommend talk to local residents, local fuel distributors, somebody who might know, the old guy down the street on the porch. A lot of times you can get that information from those kind of folks. Then you want to determine if there's product in the tank. So if there's greater than an inch is what we look for. And you would figure that out if you can open the fill port, use a gauge stick, some water finding paste, a baler, something like that. And then the last thing is there any documented contamination at this site? So normally you would go to EDMS for that if it was a registered tank. If it wasn't, then you're going to have to use, you know, visual evidence or sample data, something like that. But this is again, things you're trying to figure out before you start your project. Some things you won't be able to figure out before, but so let's say more than an inch of product, you want to, if you can open the fill port, drop a baler down there, drop a gauge stick and measure how much product is in it. A lot of times, if you're using a gauge stick, you may not know if it's gas or diesel or some kind of product or water, and it would be a good idea in those situations, coat the stick with water finding paste. The water finding paste will turn a different color, it'll turn orange, and then anything that's not orange would be product, anything that is orange would be water, so you can differentiate between the two that way. And then, of course, documented contamination. If once you start digging and you find some free-phase product in the ground, or you find some heavily stained soil with strong odors, that's evidence of contamination. All right, so you answer those questions, and then what I did was put this in a flow chart for you, and it'll help you to make a determination of whether or not DEQ is going to regulate that underground tank or not. So if you follow along with this, the first question is, was it taken out of service prior to 7/20/90? And what that date is, that's the date our underground tank regulations were promulgated. So prior to that, Louisiana had no UST regulations. So if the answer is no to that, if it was taken out of service after, DEQ is going to regulate it. If it's yes or you're not sure, then you go to the next question, is there more than an inch product? If it's yes, we're going to regulate it. If it's no, you go to the next question. If it's, is there any evidence of contamination? So if you know that, we'll regulate it. If it's no or not sure, we're going to consider that tank a permanently closed tank. The only thing you would have to do is register it and code it as taken out of service prior to 7/20/90. I'll talk a little bit more about this. You may not have to register it on certain conditions, and I'll talk about that in a second. But this is the flow chart you follow to help you to make that determination of whether or not DEQ involvement is required. All right, so I'm going to start with, if it's regulated, how to deal with it. So the first thing you want to do is you want to contact, if it's regulated, you want to contact a DEQ certified closure contractor. I'll show you how to get these in a second. But what that certified worker is going to do is they're going to assist you with all the paperwork you need to send to DEQ. They'll do the permanent closure of the tanks, hopefully following our UST regulations and our closure guidance document. And then they'll be there, and they'll be there either to do or to supervise the closure critical junctures, basically the field activities. I'll explain those in a second. So to get that certified worker list, you would go to our website and you would click on the main website, click on land, and then down under programs, it would drop down and click underground or UST. Or you could type in deq.louisiana.gov/UST and it'll go straight to it. And you scroll down until you see certified worker information. So when you click on the link that says list of UST certified workers, and that will open up a list. I think this is about a 5-page list right now. And there's the guys who are currently certified to do UST work. So anyone with a C or an IRC next to their name in the type column in the far left, a C, as long as C is in there, then they're certified to do closures. If it just says IR, they're not. So you could select anyone. Normally most people select people in the same town or general area where they're working, so they don't have to travel as far. When you select that person, you contact them, they'll help you with all the required things. But the main reason they're there is to do on-site activities to make sure they're done correctly. And they have to be either doing it themselves or supervising who's doing it. Now, they are required to be on site during these 3 activities: cleaning and vapor free in the tank, collecting the soil samples, unless you have a response action contractor there. That's the guys who can do trust fund work. Actually removal of the tank or filling it in place if you're going to leave it there and fill it full of concrete or sand or foam or whatever. So any of those 3 things, you need a certified worker there present, either doing it or supervising who's doing it. Okay, so they'll also do the notifications to us. So if it's a regulated tank site, you do have to send a notice of intent. That's the form name, and you have to send it to us 30 days prior to doing your closure. And then they have to, certify worker and the owner has to notify us prior to doing those critical junctures, all that field work. And they notify us either with a phone call or a fax or a text any notification is fine for us for that. And they'll register it if it's required. But the important thing here is if you have a construction project going on and you don't want to wait these 30 days, we're not going to make you wait these 30 days. Just give us a call, let us know what your situation is, and we're not going to make you wait. We'll let you get started and you can fill out, and we can process the paperwork after the fact. So we're easy to work with on closures like this. So after the tanks are removed, that certified worker is going to send in a closure assessment form and a report, and it's going to have all the sample data, the maps, and all the required things that we need to process it. And they'll normally put that report together, but it's going to be the responsibility of the owner to sign it and submit it to DEQ. So if it's a regulated closure and we don't get this information, it's going to be a violation for the owner. So you want to make sure that you get it from the guy within 60 days and you sign it and submit it to us. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is if it's not regulated, but before I go into that, I want to see if there's if you guys have any questions on what I've covered so far. I see one from Trey. Are you aware of a database of above ground storage tanks within the state? And the answer to that is no, I am not aware of any database of ASTs, either active or abandoned. We have talked about potentially regulating ASTs, and we're looking at it as part of a continuing resolution from one of the legislators a year ago or so. And it's something that we're considering, but as of now, no, we do not have a database of above ground storage tanks. And then you ask, there's also a question of how would I use EDMS for finding both active and abandoned? Again, that would be, you just don't click on the media and let everything open, and you're gonna have to kind of go through all the files, and hopefully something will trigger that. You might find it. And if that wasn't a good answer, just shoot me another Q&A and we'll address it at the end.
Hey, Sam,
okay, no.
Does LDEQ have a database of pre-88 closed in place USTs?
So we do have a database of pre-88, well, but it's only going to be what was registered with us. So if they were pre-88 closed in place and not registered with us, they're not going to be in our database. And I can tell you that our database is pretty good, but it's not 100%. So I wouldn't look at our database and say nothing's there, so there's definitely nothing there. You really need to do extra due diligence to find out if you have a tank. But we do have that, and if you're interested in that kind of information, you can contact me via email, and I'll have my email address at the end, and I can help you get it. We can run a query, and I can shoot you a database of what we do have.
Okay, great.
Another question is, this being all new for me, are there certain requirements that make the determination of whether the USTs could be filled rather than removed? So, we don't have anything in our regulations prohibiting closing a tank in place, filling it in place and leaving it there. Well, we do, we kind of leave that up to the property owner's discretion. But keep in mind, if you sell the property and there is a tank or multiple tanks that you filled full of concrete and filled them in place, the new property owner may not want them, and then they're going to have to dispose of 8,000 gallons of concrete. And the other consideration is, let's say there is contamination at the site and you have to excavate. You don't want a big tank sitting in the way of that. So those are the kind of things you need to think about, filling them in place versus removing them. but we don't prohibit it.
I think, Sam, one of the sites that we dealt with, a building was built over part of the underground storage tank. So it really wasn't feasible for us to actually remove the tank, and that's where we recommended that it be filled.
Oh yeah, and you will find that, and I saw a couple of participants that I know that have dealt with that personally. So yeah, you do find that kind of often. Okay, let me now go into the next part, which is if the tank is not regulated. You went through those steps and you made that determination. So I want to clarify this though, because prior to April of 2006, we made everyone remove every tank and we regulated every tank closure. And around April of 06, anywhere between there and say, took us a couple of years to kind of iron all this out, go through the legal things. And so anytime after that, we came up with we call it abandoned tank regulation interpretation. So that'll be how we address tanks that were taken out of service before our regulations went into effect, which is that 7/20/90 date. So we have a regulation that's 901A in the UST regulations, which are LAC 33 Part XI. It says that the owner and operator of a tank of a UST system that was permanently closed before that date, July 20th, shall assess and close the system if directed to do so by the department. So you don't have to do it unless we make you do it. And then the second part of that is we may make you do it if releases from the tank may have, in our judgment, pose a threat. So we're only going to make you do it if it released product. And then we're going to look at that and see how bad the contamination is, what kind of a threat it is before we pull you into regulation. So, and let me say a little bit more about that. So if it was out of service before our regs went into effect and it contains less than an inch of product, we're going to consider it permanently closed. And if you know our definitions, say permanently closed means filled with solid inert material, right? Or removed. But we're going to consider them permanently closed if they were taken out of service before that date, if they're empty, if they have filled with water, filled them with sand, partially filled them with sand or gravel. We're not going to hold them to that definition, the current definition of permanently closed, because they didn't have a permanently closed definition prior to those regs going into effect. And we're only going to regulate them for registration, unless, of course, we got contamination, but that's the wild card. So again, back to that flow chart, you go through those 3 questions, and then that'll help you make that determination. So I'm going to talk about how we deal with things that we don't regulate. All right, so you do need to register them if you're going to leave them in place. And all that, you would send in the registration form, which is on our website. It's a UST REG form. And then in your registration, you would put it was taken out of service before 7/20/90. If you're going to remove them, then you don't need to register them. There's no point. If you're going to remove them, but they were already registered, just notify us and let us know you're removing them. So some people might ask, well, if they're registered, that means y'all regulate them. And that's not, we don't. We only regulate them even if they're registered, we still use this flow chart to figure out how we're going to deal with them. So, if they're registered and they're not regulated, just notify us if you're taking them out. Okay, so I'm calling this voluntary closure. This is if you're doing it on your own without any of our assistance. You not sending us anything, which is totally fine. You don't have to follow our regulations. we recommend you follow our closure guidance document. Now, I'll show that to you in a second and explain why. You do not have to sample unless contamination is discovered. But again, I mean, we're not going to be there and you're not going to have the oversight. So that one, you know, we recommend you sample if you find contamination. That would obviously help your property owner, but we can't force you. And you don't need to register them if you're taking tanks out. So if you want our involvement in this, let's say a lot of people want a paper trail from DEQ. They want us to sign off on it. So we're going to be signing off on something we don't regulate. So this one's kind of odd, but you still don't have to follow our regs. You still don't have to follow our closure guidance document, but we do recommend it for safety and for the sampling, because if you want us to sign off on it, we would hope that you sampled in the right places so we can sign off on it and give you an NFA, which is what you would be looking for. You don't have to register them if you're taking them out. There is a $1,650 review fee, and that's a review fee that the department charges when we review things that we're not required to do by our regulations. So the regs don't require you to send in any information. So we'll charge that fee. And again, and it's not always, you may not always be charged a fee, but there is a very good possibility. So then you would send that report to Gary Fulton, and yep, Gary is still our UST administrator. Someone asked that question. We didn't get rid of him yet. So Gary is our administrator. You would send that report to him, and they'll make that determination whether the review fee is charged or not. Okay, so if you find contamination during this voluntary closure, that would be free product, heavily stained soil with strong petroleum odors, or you took samples prior to doing it and you found that they indicated a release. Someone asked if contamination is found in groundwater near the tank, is sampling required? Again, this is a voluntary closure and really nothing's required, but yeah, you should if you find contaminated groundwater near a tank site you're removing. If it's one of these voluntary things, you should sample it. And again, that's to protect you and the tank owner and further property use. If it was a normal closure that we do regulate, absolutely, we would require you to sample the contaminated groundwater. It's not part of normal closure sampling, but anything out of the ordinary that you find contamination-wise, we want you to sample during a normal closure. Hope that answers your question, Michael. And if you find contamination, you notify our single point of contact. We call it SPOC or SPOC. If you hear us say SPOC, that's what we're talking about. That's the phone number. And you could also do it online on the DEQ website. You just go to the DEQ website, and then on it, there's a button for online reporting. And then at that time, after you send us the information, then DEQ and Gary's group and Tad's group are going to review it and decide if further action is required, if you need to do further assessment, or if you need to do a cleanup. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the safety part of it. Now this is if you're going to do this yourself and not use a certified worker, and if it meets all those DEQ doesn't regulate it requirements, you can pull the thing yourself, but we really want you to do it safely. So the best thing to do is to go to our website, to the UST page, scroll down to this UST installation closure information heading, click on the UST closure change in service guidance document. And that's what the cover page, looks like it's effective May 1st, 2010. That's the most current one. And it's going to have a list of all it's a pretty big document, and it goes through all our closure processes. You know, when do you have to report to us? all kind of general information and safety guidelines, sample loop, how to take your samples and where, what to analyze them for, how to interpret it. And that, again, that's available on our website. All I'm going to talk about today, since you're doing this, it's not regulated, are the safety guidelines. And I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I'm going to hit the main ones. So the first thing you want to do is empty the UST. You want to, usually you'll put a hose in it, connect it to a back truck, and you're sucking the product out. And the reason you do that is you don't want to start trying to pull a tank out that has product in it. You can see this guy was actually pulling a tank out with used oil, and he punctured the tank, and it used oil filled in the tank hole, and he had a much bigger mess and a bigger cleanup than he would. He shouldn't have had any cleanup, but he ended up ruining that tank hole, and they had to excavate a whole bunch of contaminated soil. So make sure the tank's empty before you mess with it. Second thing, you want to clean it. And normally what you'll do is they'll use high pressure spray, maybe some Dawn or some different things with water, and they'll spray water in it and flush it out and suck the water and product out. And usually any used oil recycler who's got a back truck can do that for you. Next thing is you want to purge or inert it. So purging a tank is where you remove the flammable vapors, and inerting it is you either displace the oxygen or remove the oxygen. And what you do this so you want to keep the thing from blowing up. You don't want your tank exploding. So to purge it, what you would do is connect what's called a venturi tube on top of the tank and connect it to an air compressor. And you'll blow a bunch of air in it, and it'll suck the vapors out and expel them out of the top. So all the gas vapors are going to be blown out of the tank, basically. And we do ask that you do this on non-ozone attainment days, and you can find those on our website under the air program. Just because you don't want to pump up, whenever you have a high ozone day, you don't want to pump a bunch more volatiles in the air. So we ask that you don't do those on those days. If you do, don't tell anybody. Then what you want to do is use a combustible gas indicator. This is also known as an explosimeter, and you want to check the LEL level, which is the lower explosive limit, and that tells you if you have any flammable vapors, anything combustible in that tank. So you want that LEL number to be less than 10. Anything of 10 or above, if you have a spark, that tank can explode. If you're going to inert it, that's displace the oxygen, you're going to be using dry ice, and you'll put dry ice in the tank. And again, if you're going to go that route, again, you want to use a combustible gas indicator, except you're going to be using the oxygen section of it, and you want your oxygen percentage to be less than 5. Someone asked if LDEQ air permit is required in order to purge a tank, and the answer to that would be no. You don't need, air permits are not required to purge a tank. So no need to deal with the air folks on that. And the reason you're doing it is you don't want an explosion. We've had cases where tanks have exploded. This is one, you can see the remnants of the fiberglass tank and all the broken up concrete where actually the guy working on it dropped a light inside of the tank, and it blew up, and it threw him a long ways and killed him. Here was another one where the guy was cutting on the tank without it being vapor free, and it actually blew the fill port out of the tank and threw it about 150 feet in the air, and it landed in the windshield of a car. And I shouldn't be laughing, but it hit the passenger side windshield, and nobody was sitting there, so nobody got hurt, but it was traumatized the person pretty good. So the moral of the story is you don't want your tanks blowing up. And then the next thing you want to do is remove your tank safely. This is probably not the backhoe operator you want. You want to make sure that when you take it out, you have enough equipment to be able to handle it. And when you take it out, you're going to be labeling it. And this is the information we recommend you label the tank with. Again, you'll have a copy of this PowerPoint, so I'm not going to read all of this to you. And then once it's out the ground, this is really important. You want to check that LEL again. You want to make sure that the tank is not explosive, because when it's out the ground, normally a hole is going to be cut into the sides of the thing to keep the vapors from coming out. So sometimes they'll use non-sparking tools, which is what we recommend, but every now and then guys will come out here with a cutting torch and sparks flying everywhere. And if this tank is not vapor free, if your LEL's too high, this guy it would not be a good thing. Put it that way. So you don't want your tank exploding after you have it out and you're working on it. So you'll see, then they'll load it on a trailer. You can see the hole cut in. This one's not labeled, but normally you'll be having a label on it as well. And then you'll take it to a scrap yard or a disposal site. So normally if it's a metal tank, you'll use scrap yards will take it. If it's an industrial solid waste, if it's a fiberglass tank or maybe a tank coated with epoxy, the scrap yards may not take it. You may have to send it to solid waste facility. Just make sure it's not, you don't send it to a construction demolition landfill. They're not permitted to take these kind of things. You want to definitely get proof of disposal or bill of sale. Oh, and you can't reuse it as an underground tank. And if it was a gasoline tank, you can't use it as coverts or to store food or liquid. The gasoline has benzene in it. It's a carcinogen. It soaks into the steel and it does release over time. So you definitely can't use it for these kind of activities. Here's an example of 3 tanks that were pulled and brought out to a farm, and the guy was going to use them as covers, cut the ends off, and they were still full of sludge. And when I showed up, his son was in the tank with a shovel and actually fell backwards in it. And when he got up, I mean, he was coated with sludge. I didn't want to take a picture of that. But what he ended up doing was the owner took the property owner took all the sludge out and spread it out in the yard. And he had a big cleanup on his hands. And just to make matters worse, this guy's dad worked for DEQ in my office. So, you can't make that stuff up. So, but it does happen. So make sure your tanks go to the right place. And last thing, if you don't want to use, if you don't feel comfortable doing it yourself, you don't want to read our guidance document or follow those safety things, then we recommend you use a certified closure contractor. Again, you don't have to, but we do recommend it because they do know the safety requirements. And again, you can find the certified worker folks on our website. And that's it for my stuff. My contact information is here. Best way to reach me is email. Don't send it to sam.broussard because he works for DOTD and I may not get the email forward to me. Make sure you use samuel.broussard. And feel free to contact me anytime with questions. And I'm going to answer one more that just popped up. Assuming contaminated soil smell is found during the course of an unregulated tank closure, would the reporting requirements under Section 707, yeah, unfortunately, Trey, it is. That was some of the conditions that our legal guys put on us when we did talk about this abandoned tank thing. They said any kind of evidence of contamination, including odors. But what I would normally, be careful with that because, you know, you're cleaning a tank that had product in it. So the odors may be coming from the tank itself. But if you got, you know, stained soil with odors in it, yeah, you should report that as well. But you could also, you could sample it. And if the numbers are below recap, then you don't have to report it. So that's kind of a caveat to that. So now what I will do is turn it over to Tad Loop, who's going to talk about remediation and other forms of our tank closure program. And again, after we're done, I'm going to stick around if you have any more questions on the compliance part of it and tank removal.
All right, well, Tad's bringing up his presentation. I'll answer Trey Hess's question. If a canopy for a petroleum brownfield is in the way of an assessment, can it be removed as investigation-derived waste? So there are provisions where if you are trying to do an assessment and there is something blocking you from actually digging underneath to get to where you need to sample, there is sometimes options in order to use your assessment fund to remove that, but your best bet, contact your EPA project officer, run it by them, you know, send them photos and site plans and get them in the loop and check with them to see if that would be an eligible activity underneath your grant. And a couple of things on what Sam mentioned. I love the safety presentation. Even if you don't plan on doing it yourself, it's still good to know what to look for when you go out to your sites to make sure your contractors are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And if you do have a site where you're planning on pulling tanks, make sure to keep Jennifer and I in the loop on that. We have some funding underneath our Brownfield program that we can help with some of those oversight costs. So we might be able to work with you on that. And I didn't know that we didn't have to register tanks if we're going to pull them out. So I'm glad to learn that, Sam. Thanks for that. So Tad, I will hand it back to you.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. Good afternoon, everyone. As always, Sam did an excellent job covering information related to the discovery underground storage tanks at abandoned sites and the compliance requirements for managing tanks as a regulated or unregulated tank. So you discovered previously unknown tanks on your property. You perform the tank closure and assessment, if required. Based on site conditions or analytical results, you determined that a release from the regulated UST system had occurred. So this part of the webinar will summarize the remediation process within the UST division to address past and present confirmed releases. So left unattended, past and present releases can contaminate soil, groundwater, surface water, or indoor air if enclosed structures are present or will be built. UST regulations require that release, response, and corrective action at contaminated UST sites must be conducted to restore and protect groundwater resources and maintain a safe environment for those who live or work around these sites. So we'll also provide an overview of the abandoned tank closure and assessment program. This program provides a financial assistance for the removal of abandoned tanks and for the assessment and remediation of contaminated property. So before we move on, I'd like to pose a trivia question. Since this webinar is about abandoned sites, does anyone recognize this famous or maybe infamous abandoned gas station in the photo? And also, what historical event occurred at this station? So if you have an answer or just want to guess, write it in the Q&A section. I'll give a hint, it's in north central Louisiana. And after the webinar, maybe Rebecca can read any answers that we receive. So we'll provide a general overview of the remediation process from the notification of a confirmed release to the closure of the incident. We'll also discuss the establishment of the abandoned tank program, the restricted use, the eligibility process, and state contracts. We have a few slides to briefly show you some completed or current projects. And finally, details about the financial status of the program. So leaking underground storage tanks can be one of the leading causes of soil and groundwater contamination. Louisiana declared that protection of its groundwater is a priority, as most of these waters provide a primary source of drinking water. So the Louisiana legislature mandated that DEQ develop minimum remediation standards for soil, groundwater, and surface water quality necessary for the remediation of property. In response to the mandate, DEQ developed the Risk Evaluation Corrective Action Program, also known as RECAP. This is the primary mandate for all remediation activities in Louisiana. So what is RECAP? RECAP uses risk evaluation to identify constituent levels in impacted media that do not pose a risk to human health and the environment, and to determine if corrective action is necessary for the protection of human health and environment. It consists of a tiered framework composed of screening standards and management options that allow site evaluations and corrective action efforts that's tailored to the site conditions and the risk. So without RECAP, risk evaluation would not be performed consistently in Louisiana. The regulated community has a clear understanding of DEQ's requirements, and the general public will be certain as to the criteria used by DEQ for remediation decisions. So in UST regulations, Part 11, 715A, it adopts the RECAP regulation. It states in part that owners and operators of petroleum, motor fuel, or hazardous substance USTs shall, in response to a confirmed release from the UST system, comply with the requirements of this section. Investigations and corrective actions required by this section shall comply with RECAP. So the RECAP regulations were initially adopted on December 20th, 1998. The current document is the third revision. DEQ began a fourth revision in 2019, which is currently in the rulemaking process. So since this webinar focuses on brownfield sites, it is important to note that state law allows for the implementation of a partial remedial action plan with liability incentives under DEQ's voluntary remediation program. However, remedial actions within the UST division require full and complete compliance with the RECAP requirements to achieve a no further action determination. So what is a confirmed release? It is any contamination from a UST system to the environment that is evidenced by phase product to the environment and or concentrations above any RECAP screening option standard that requires either a cleanup or any further evaluation in order to close the site. A good example of confirmed release, as shown in the photo, is the discovery of free phase product in groundwater monitoring wells or release detection devices, which are known as RDDs. Typical confirmed releases that this audience is more likely to report are analytical results of UST closure samples and phase 2 environmental site assessments above the RECAP screening option standard, for example, benzene or xylene concentrations in soil and or groundwater. So the UST division follows internal standard operating procedures to identify and implement the appropriate release response at UST sites, which may be active, temporarily closed, or permanently closed. The release confirmation and site assignment process is initiated upon receiving DEQ's single point of contact notification or the spot notification. UST managers verify the confirmed release and assign the incident to a UST team leader. So this team leader is your single point of contact for all remediation related activities dealing with soil and groundwater issues through investigation, risk evaluation, corrective action, and corrective action monitoring until the incident is closed. The team leader will review all available information related to the release and the site history. So after the review is completed, they will make a determination to advance the site through a remediation process or grant an incident closure. The team leader may grant an incident closure at this stage based on the release information, current guidance, and an evaluation of site conditions using the appropriate RECAP standards. If additional site data is needed or further remediation is warranted, The team leader will proceed to the site investigation process by requesting a detailed work plan to complete further investigation activities. Further investigations are conducted for the purposes of defining the site characteristics, determining the nature, horizontal, and vertical extent of contamination, predicting fate and transport of contaminants, identifying potential exposure pathways and receptors, and determining the need for corrective action. So all investigation activities are completed in accordance with Recap Appendix B, including the development of a site investigation report. So upon completion of the investigation activities, a site investigation and recap evaluation report must be completed. A risk-based evaluation of the results of the investigation will be required in most cases. All reports must meet the general data and format requirements as outlined in the recap document, including the development of remedial standards for the site. So the team leader will review the reports to determine if the evaluation was accurate and correct, to determine if the delineation was completed, and to verify that remedial standards are acceptable. So after reviewing the recap report, the team leader may grant an incident closure at this phase of the process also if the site investigation process is complete and the residual concentrations do not exceed the remedial standards for the site. If contamination is present in soil or groundwater at levels exceeding the standards, the team leader will initiate the corrective action process. So remediation will be required to reduce the concentration to acceptable levels, which are considered at or below the remedial standards. So the department will require a corrective action plan from the owner, proposing multiple remedial technologies that are feasible and cost-effective at reducing the contaminant levels in soil and or groundwater. Technologies can be as simple as soil excavation to complex systems like dual phase extraction or ozone sparging systems. Team leader is tasked with reviewing the proposed technologies and approving one or a combination of technologies for implementation. So if the site is eligible for the Louisiana Motor Fuels UST Trust Fund, the DEQ's Remediation Oversight Group, or what we call ROG, must approve corrective action plans for the UST division. So the ROG is a group of senior level staff members who are tasked with reviewing and approving high cost remedial activities. So the UST division must follow all guidelines established by the ROG for requesting, reviewing, and approving all plans. Depending on the extent of contamination or the approved technology, the corrective action process could be completed quickly or may continue for several years. Continuous groundwater monitoring is often associated with long-term corrective action and is conducted on a schedule established in the approved plan or modified by the department. So groundwater monitoring provides a method to observe the effectiveness of the remedial technology over time. So when this corrective action monitoring demonstrates that all soil and groundwater contamination have been remediated to levels at or below the recap standards, the team leader proceeds to the incident closure or the release closure process. It is the process in which the UST division will implement the final stages of the remediation process. With department approval, the owner will be allowed to begin activities to restore the site to conditions prior to the release. So this involves the proper plug and abandonment of all boreholes and monitoring wells, removal of the remediation system, and the disposal of all investigation waste, for example, drill cuttings and purge water. After the site restoration is verified, the department will issue a no further action determination to close the incident. So on the recap, an NFA determination may be granted at the site where the source of the release has been removed, the site does not pose a risk, and residual concentrations are appropriate for the intended future use of the land. So occasionally the use of institutional controls such as conveyance notices is warranted to obtain an NFA. Conveyance notices may be attached to the property to restrict land use for only commercial or industrial purposes. There are additional forms of incident closures that are often used by the UST division. As previously mentioned, a team leader may grant closure without further investigation or corrective action. In those cases, they include the UST closure completion letter or a no further interest letter. So the closure completion letter is issued when releases associated with tank closures are closed under using recap standards without the need for further action. The no further interest, the NFI, is utilized to close incidences associated with typical phase 2 assessments, all other confirmed releases when further action is not warranted. So what are the costs? As you can see, remediation response action is very expensive. In most cases, several investigations to fully delineate the site may be required. So the average cost to complete a full site investigation at a site can be as much as $90,000 or more. Investigations coupled with corrective action can increase those costs significantly. Based on years of budget review, corrective action costs can range from $400,000 to $900,000 or more if the site is located in a groundwater protection area of a drinking water system. So there are some common funding mechanisms to assist owners with the cost of remediating property. The less common mechanisms available are self-insured and private insurance. Obviously, self-funded mechanisms would not be a popular choice. An owner may qualify as an eligible participant of the Motor Fuels UST Trust Fund. We have a short presentation following this session to provide some general information about the fund. It was established as a mechanism for owners of regulated motor fuel USTs to demonstrate financial responsibility for taking corrective action and for compensating third parties for injury or property damage. And finally, the abandoned tank program, which we'll cover next. So the abandoned tank program, the purpose of the program is to provide a financial assistance to tank owners to conduct tank closures, site assessments, and or remediation to resolve any enforcement actions issued by the department. It provides a means of financial assurance which they could not otherwise obtain to resolve the non-compliant issues. The UST division has developed 2 separate processes and contracts to manage the tank closures and provide services for the site assessment and or remediation. So under the provisions of Act 1121 of 2001 and Title 30-2195, the abandoned tank program was established. It states that beginning on July 1st, 2001, all interest money earned by the Motor Fuels UST Trust Fund and all monies received from payments resulting from cost recovery efforts shall be used for the closure of abandoned regulated motor fuel USTs and assessment and remediation of property contaminated by abandoned USTs. So what is the definition of a motor fuel UST? So any regulated UST that receive and dispense motor fuels as defined. For example, all grades of gasoline, diesel, kerosene, aviation fuels, and new and used motor oil used for lubricating engines. So to summarize, the abandoned tank program provides for the closure of motor fuel USTs that are no longer in service or have been abandoned by an owner or operator due to financial hardship. It also provides for the assessment and remediation of contaminated property that would not be eligible for the Motor Fuels UST Trust Fund. And this is key. Under the provisions of the program, the state shall have a lien or privilege against immovable property for the costs incurred for the activities completed. So the law provides criteria for the tank or site to be eligible for the abandoned tank program. A tank may be declared to be an abandoned motor fuel UST by the secretary upon finding that all of the following apply to the site. The site has received motor fuels in an abandoned storage tank. The motor fuel UST was not closed, or the site was not assessed or remediated in accordance with the requirements of the regulation. It constitutes or may constitute a danger or potential danger to public health or environment. It has no financially responsible owner or operator who can be located, or such person has failed or refused to undertake action ordered by the secretary. And the release at the site is not eligible for the Motor Fuels UST Trust Fund, or the secretary has determined that action by the department is the most timely and efficient way to address conditions at the site. So this slide briefly illustrates each stage of the process to accept the site into the program. The process usually begins with scheduled compliance inspections and then follows with the enforcement process until eligibility is determined and the site is accepted. And we'll take each one individually. The inspection process. All regulated UST sites are inspected every 3 years, regardless if the USTs are active or temporarily closed. The inspectors document areas of concern, which are violations discovered during the course of the compliance inspections. Sites that have been closed for many years with no response from the owners are often identified as potential program sites during the inspection process. And for contaminated sites that require site assessments or remediation, team leaders document the owner's failure to complete the remediation response action in this stage of the process. All areas of concern documented during the inspection or notices of failure to complete the site assessment or remediation are referred to DEQ's Enforcement Division for further action. So our Enforcement Division reviews and processes the referred violations from the UST Division. They will issue enforcement action in the form of a compliance order that directs the owner to comply with the UST regulations within a certain time frame. So sites that are accepted into the program are usually associated with actions ordering the owner to complete a 24-month temporary closure assessment, a permanent closure, or even the site investigation in the UST remediation process. To continue the process in the abandoned tank program, the owner must notify the Enforcement Division of their financial inability to comply with the order and the UST regulations. So a financial affidavit with appropriate records to demonstrate their inability is required. So the owner must complete the forms and submit them to the department for an eligibility review. The Enforcement Division will arrange an internal committee meeting with DEQ's legal, UST, Financial Services Division to review the compliance history and the financial forms. The committee determines if the site meets all the criteria under the provisions for eligibility and if the owner demonstrates a financial hardship. If all conditions are met, the site is accepted into the abandoned tank program to complete the activities to close the enforcement action against the owner. The UST Division submits a memorandum to the DEQ secretary to declare the site abandoned. Upon signing the declaration, the site is added to the UST abandoned tank program list. So now that the site has been approved for inclusion in the program, the priority ranking of the site must be completed. This stage also includes the site selection to complete the required action and the oversight process. A team leader is assigned to manage the site from the priority ranking process until the site is closed. The team leader completes an internal UST abandoned tank ranking form to determine a numerical ranking value that is used to evaluate the degree of risk to the public health and environment. A notice of lien letter is sent to the owner informing them of the site's inclusion into the abandoned tank program. It also requests a signed access agreement form granting DEQ personnel and its contractors access to the property. So this ranking value is based on existing and potential risk factors, including the regional groundwater classification, potential receptors, tank age and integrity, and possible off-site impacts. The numerical ranking value establishes the priority list. Sites with higher ranking value are those with the greatest need for abandoned tank program response, where there may be other conditions and factors that could affect the priority of the site. When a site is selected from the priority list for tank closure or assessment work, work orders are issued to the contractors. The contractor and the team leader determine a date to complete the activities. A notice is sent to the owner if available, and the notice includes the time frame that activities will begin and the contact information for the contractor and the team leader. The team leader will provide oversight as the department's representative until all activities are completed. Contractors are required to complete tank closures in accordance with the UST closure guidance document, and all assessment and remediation activities are performed in accordance with recap. And upon completing the activities, the department will prepare the notice of lien for the cost and file the lien against the property in the conveyance records of the parish in which the site is located. So how do we reimburse contractors for completed activities? A contractor bid announcement was issued to all DEQ certified UST workers to perform tank closures under the abandoned tank program. All state procurement requirements for competitive bids were applied. The competitive bid contracts were awarded to contractors in designated North and South regions on June 21st, 2018. To provide services to complete site assessments and remediation activities, the UST division issued a request for statement of interest and qualifications to all DEQ response action contractors, or what we call RACs. An internal selection committee awarded work agreements to 4 qualified RACs based on the region and a ranking score. All costs associated with site assessment and remediation of abandoned sites are reimbursed according to the Motor Fuels UST Trust Fund cost control guidance document. So this map illustrates the designated North and South regions for contracts to perform the tank closures. So the North region contract was awarded to Lone Oak Environmental and became effective on June 26, 2018. The contract was extended for 3 years, and that contract will expire on June 25th, 2021. The South region contract was awarded to EDI Environmental Services and became effective on June 26, 2018. The contract was also extended for 3 years, and that contract will also expire on June 25th, 2021. The UST division will be soliciting for new bids in early 2021 to continue work in the program. So we expect the new contract will be effective on July 1, 2021. So this map shows the 4 designated regions for the work agreements to complete the site assessment and remediation activities. The regions were designated to closely match the geographical boundaries of DEQ's regional offices. So regional work agreements between the RAC and DEQ were awarded through the statement of interest and qualification process. The work agreements were effective on November 1st, 2019, and will expire on June 30th, 2022. However, the UST division has the option to extend the work agreements for an additional 24-month period or until June 30th, 2024. So work agreements were signed with 4 qualifying RACs to perform the response action. The RACs are PPM Consultant, Jones Environmental, Jesco, and Leaf Environmental. So this map shows the locations in the designated North and South regions where the program has completed or currently working on abandoned tank closures. The project locations are widely spread throughout the state. As you can see, most of the sites are located in groundwater protection areas. And this is based on the program's numerical priority ranking system. There's a little cluster in the Washington Parish area, and that's because our contractor comes from Lafayette, so we have him do, every time he travels to Washington, we try to get him to do at least a couple of sites at a time instead of just one. So the following slides will provide some examples of sites that were accepted into the program and where tanks have been removed. Yes, this is a site we're working on. We're often presented with many challenges when working on these sites. As you can see, this site had a collapsed building, overgrown with vegetation. And we're also having difficulties with actually finding the tanks. So we're bringing in equipment to try to remove some trees and debris and see if we can find, as Sam pointed out, vent lines, fill ports, things like that. There's some additional sites that were accepted in the program, and we removed the tanks. This one's in Terrebonne Parish. Again, in Washington Parish. This one's in Jennings and Jeff Davis Parish. So this site was located in New Orleans East. It sustained major damage during Hurricane Katrina. The site is also on our list as an abandoned remediation site. The site had a 3,600 gallon gasoline release in the 1980s that is not trust fund eligible, and it has not been closed. The UST division in Iraq assigned to this region are currently preparing a work plan to continue investigation activities and hopefully develop a recap evaluation and possibly close the site. Another site in Webster Parish. This site was interesting. The city of Haynesville proposed to improve the intersection by adding a right turning lane. However, the 3 tanks were located in the expansion area. The blue dots identify the fill ports where the tanks were located and a rough drawing of where the right turning lane is proposed. Our contractor had to come in and saw cut the highway to allow for the tank removal. All work was done under the supervision of our state highway department. And yes, there's actually an abandoned gas station in the trees. Our contractor had to complete some much needed land clearing to find and remove the tanks. We were expecting to remove only 2 tanks, but actually found 4 tanks that had to be removed. Here's a site finally cleared. In the photo on the left is my buddy Chip Gravenberg overseeing the tank closure. A week after this project, Chip retired from the department. So I really hope it wasn't the site that forced him into retirement. So the next few slides will reflect some figures that we track after tank closures are completed. Since the effective date of the contract, we removed 71 tanks statewide. The graph shows the breakdown of tanks removed in each region, each north and south region. Those 71 tanks equates to a little over 230,000 gallons of total tank capacity that we removed. Our contractors removed and properly disposed of over 95,000 gallons of impacted fluids. That includes water and product from tanks that could have potentially discharged the environment over time. The department has expended nearly $430,000 statewide for tank closures since the effective date of the contract. And on average, average cost per site for tank closures statewide is approximately $18,000, which some slight differences in north and south. So this is a brief summary of our remediation projects under the program. We currently have 20 remediation sites on the priority list. We are actively working on 8 of the priority sites at this time, and we expect to increase that work. The sites were selected based on site conditions that include the presence of free product or that have drinking water classifications for groundwater. In Louisiana, those are considered as groundwater classification 1 or 2. We currently have approved budgets that amount to $428,000. The UST division received an EPA grant under the 2017 Hurricane Disaster Relief Act. We're fortunate to have those funds available to cover remediation costs at 2 of those sites. And again, all remediation activities in the abandoned tank program are completed in accordance with the UST remediation procedures and the recap document. So this slide briefly illustrates the program's revenue and fund balance. As stated, the program is funded by the interest earned from the Motor Fuels Trust Fund. The graph presents the interest earned over the past 4 years. The program's cash balance at the end of June was approximately $13 million. And our annual budget is usually set at about $1.2 million, and that includes tank closures and assessment and remediation. So that's my contact information. And Rebecca, if there are any questions, you can answer any questions before we move on to the Motor Fuel Trust Fund slides.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions. First, I just wanted to say this is a really great resource for some of our brownfield sites. We know that there's not enough brownfield funding to cover all the abandoned tanks that are out there. So there might be a way for us to partner with the abandoned tank programs. We have to take into consideration that they do put a lien on the property if DEQ pays for that tank to be removed. But as you can see with the cost of some of the assessments and cleanups, it might be worth it depending on the future use of the site. So a couple of questions that came in for the abandoned tank program for a tax adjudicated property, who is considered the owner for purposes of site access, tank removal paperwork, that type of thing?
That's a good question. I don't think we know, but from my understanding, the parish is not considered an owner, but we do try to, we have communicated with parish attorneys who have granted us access, but we don't necessarily need the access agreement. We like to have it, but when it comes down to conducting the work, we don't actually need it. I hope that's a good answer.
And then the second one, could you elaborate on the ranking criteria for the abandoned tank list? If the abandoned tank is located within the city's brownfield target area, could that be considered another factor in bumping up the site's priority?
We can have factors that may change the ranking or the priority list that affects the ranking. It is currently not in our form that is used to develop that ranking value, but often we can consider other factors to maybe expedite a site if we're aware of it or if we're notified.
And then related to that, is the ranking of each something you can share?
I'm certain we could. Was the question if we can share the ranking score and how each side is prioritized? Was that the question?
Yes.
Okay. We do have an internal database that produces our priority list by score. So we could probably make that available.
And Tad, if one of our local brownfield programs had a site that they maybe wanted to enter into the abandoned tank program, how would they, is that something they can do locally, or is that something internal, or how would they go about that?
Well, the abandoned tank program has to go through an enforcement process. So first it has to be a regulated tank, as Sam went through the slides to demonstrate what's the regulated tank. So the other qualification or criteria for the abandoned tank program is that regulated tank went through an enforcement process and the department issued a compliance order to comply with some part of the UST regulation. And if the owner demonstrates they not financially able to comply with that order, that's when the review process and the eligibility process to determine if that site meets or can be added to the abandoned tank program. We can't just find a tank and put it in the program, I guess is the easy answer.
All right, sounds good. Those are all the questions in the Q&A for right now. So I think Tad's going to go over the Motor Fuels Trust Fund, and then we'll hear from Jennifer. We might go a little past 4 o'clock, but like I said, these are being recorded. So if you need to jump off early, you will be able to come back to the recording if you missed the last part. But we're just going to keep going to make sure we answer everybody's questions and everyone feels comfortable with this by the time that we're done. So Tad, would you like to cover the Motor Fuels Trust Fund?
Sure, we'll try to go through it pretty quickly. Just want to say that I do not work in the trust fund section. However, the manager gave me permission to go through the slides, and he is, I think, on the webinar to offer some answers if everyone has questions. So we'll just begin. The UST Trust Fund was established as a funding mechanism to help owners and operators of eligible USTs to meet financial responsibility regulations. So UST regulations require that owners and operators of all petroleum or motor fuel UST systems shall demonstrate financial responsibility for taking corrective action or for compensating third parties for damage caused by releases from the operation of a petroleum underground storage tank. So all facilities subjected to these requirements must use one or a combination of allowable mechanisms as provided in the regulations. The UST is one of the allowable mechanisms for motor fuel UST owners. So these requirements do not apply to owners or operators of any UST system that is exempt, excluded, or partially excluded by definition or regulation, as Sam had gone over in previous slides. So the trust fund was established under the provisions of Title 30, 2195, which was effective on July 15th, 1988. So any release from a motor fuel UST that occurred prior to this date would not be covered under the trust fund. So it is managed by DEQ's Financial Services Division and is designed to reimburse necessary and appropriate costs for the remediation of soils, groundwater, and surface waters at contaminated motor fuel UST sites. So the maximum disbursement from the trust fund per release associated with eligible tanks is $1.5 million minus any deductible amount. So this maximum amount also includes for payment of third-party claims from a final judgment against the tank owner. So the trust fund was initially financed through a per tank fee of $100 per year. In the 90s, state law changed the fee structure from a per tank rate to a rate based on the number of gallons delivered to a UST. So the current rate is set at $72 for each delivery of 9,000 gallons of fuel, which is 0.8 of 1 cent per gallon. The fee is collected by the bulk operators and remitted to DEQ on a monthly basis. So the fee generates approximately $22 million per year. Also, a per tank fee rate of $275 is collected for all new and used oil storage tank. The tank fee is collected annually and provides a revenue of approximately $27,000 per year. So this graph reflects the revenue collected annually for the trust fund. As you can see, the collected fees have remained consistent over the past 10 years at approximately $22 million. So are you eligible? An eligible participant means any owner of an underground motor fuel storage tank who has registered a newly installed or operating tank with the department prior to the date of the release, has paid the annual tank registration fees along with any late payment fees and has met the deductible requirements. So trust fund processes reimbursement claims only after the owner has paid all deductible amounts. So an eligibility determination may be requested from the trust fund section after a release has been reported to the department. An application along with all supporting documentation must be submitted for review. It also contains affidavits that must be signed and notarized by the responsible party. So the application is available on DEQ Financial Services Trust Fund webpage or by requesting a hard copy from the trust fund section. So the link is provided on this slide where you may find that application. And we'll show you a screenshot of the web page. If you click About DEQ on the menu bar, and then on the left side of the screen, you find Financial Services, and in that drop-down menu is Trust Fund, and you can find the application, which is the most recent version is July 2017. So listed are common review questions that must be answered in the eligibility determination process. Were the tanks registered at the time of the release? Trust fund will not cover releases from USTs that were not previously registered. So have all annual UST registration fees been paid? Did the owner select Motor Fuels Trust Fund as their financial responsibility mechanism on the UST registration form? An owner or operator must select one or a combination of mechanisms to meet the financial responsibility requirements. Has DEQ confirmed that a release occurred? And has DEQ requested further investigation for the release? This goes back to the UST remediation process where our managers and team leaders confirm releases and then request work plans for further investigations from the responsible party. As a participant, the owner has fulfilled the financial responsibility requirements except for the amounts that are not covered by the trust fund, for example, the deductible. So the deductible amounts must be paid by the owner before any reimbursements from the trust fund can be processed. The current deductible amounts are based on results of a compliant or non-compliant review of the facility. So if the site is 100% compliant and all required documentation were provided in the application, the deductible for each release is $0. If the site was found to be out of compliance for one or more of the criteria outlined in the revised statute, or the required documentation was not provided, the non-compliant deductible is $10,000 per release. And that's also per product. If you had a gasoline and a diesel release, then it would be $20,000, $10,000 each. Whenever the department determines that a release from a motor fuel UST owned by an eligible participant has occurred, the trust fund will obligate funds to provide for investigation and remediation. Because there are limited funds available to perform cleanups, there are reimbursement limitations for cost control. Trust fund will reimburse only those costs which return the site to the use in effect at the time the release occurred. This may affect sites that were considered commercial or industrial at the time of the release, but later changed to a residential land use. Trust fund will not cover costs to restore the site to a residential land use. Trust fund can only reimburse response action contractors, which are the RAPs, as we previously mentioned, who are certified with DEQ. So trust fund cannot reimburse costs for activities older than 2 years based upon the request date for reimbursement. And the release from the USTs that contain substances other than motor fuels are not covered. So again, a screenshot to find the rack list. Click on About LDEQ, go to Financial Services, Trust Fund on the left, and you'll find a rack list, which is the same page you find the application and all other documents related to trust fund. It's an example of the rack list where you find your response action contractor. So this graph reflects the annual reimbursement amounts from the trust fund over the past 10 years. There are some fluctuations, but total claims are usually around $12 to $14 million per year. As with any state program, the trust fund had undergone several changes to statutes during recent legislature sessions. Act 227 of 2015 session, 277, sorry, 2015 session increased the maximum amount that can be reimbursed per release from the trust fund from $1 million to the current $1.5 million. The DEQ secretary authorized the increase to be applied retroactively to previous releases that occurred prior to the law's effective date, which was August 1st, 2015, for any assessment and remediation costs that occurred within 2 years of the request date for reimbursement. So Act 521 of 2016 implemented additional revisions to the trust fund statutes. One of the major changes was the 2-year rule. To be eligible for the trust fund, the initial assessment shall be initiated within 2 years from the receipt of a request by the department for an assessment. So what is the interpretation of initiation of an assessment? So currently it is interpreted as the date of DEQ's approval of the initial investigation work plan submitted by the RAC. The 2-year rule is tracked by sending the request for assessment by certified mail and the signature data on the returned green card. The receipt date on the green card begins the 2-year clock to get the initial work plan approved. That runs through it all. If there are any questions, I can answer it, or maybe Jeff might be able to offer an answer.
Jeff, is there anything that you want to add while Jennifer is bringing up her presentation?
No, Tad did a great job.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, I think the, most of the tanks that we find are a little bit of a surprise and not registered, but there are those sites within the communities that could have registered tanks, and they don't really, especially if they were inherited, they might not realize that this is a resource that they could utilize. So thanks, Tad, for that overview. Great overview. Jennifer, would you like to talk about how USTs and Brownfields and some special cases and information about that?
Sure. Yeah, hi, I'm Jennifer Schatzel with the LDEQ Remediation Division. I've been involved in brownfield projects for about 15 years. Most of that time was spent as a consultant. So just real quick, since we're short on time, I was just going to go kind of through a few common issues and things that I've encountered at UST brownfield sites over the years. So as Sam kind of discussed, you have a phase 1 or something that has identified indications of a potential UST. One of the most common and sometimes aggravating issues I've encountered is trying to actually find where is that tank, or is it even still there? Sometimes you may be lucky and the indicator that was found is fill ports or sumps. They're visible at the site. Usually the fill ports are this is all right above the tank, right near the tank. So you have a really good idea of exactly where they are when you're gonna go to remove them. Other times, maybe some not so obvious at locating the tank indicators would be just maybe there's the presence of vent pipes or dispensers at the site. Sometimes these are not always close to the tanks. The tanks might be, a little off, probably not too far, but a little off. And it's been paved over and you don't see any fill ports or anything. So you're not really sure where they are or if they're even still there. Maybe they were removed and the rest wasn't. Sanborn maps, same thing. These are usually, you'll get one from the 1940s, 1950s, kind of what shown in the bottom right hand, that shows there were some gas tanks at the site. However, since then, the building or other reference point is no longer present. So you kind of have some issues with finding the exact location of the tanks to remove it. Oftentimes, I've encountered this a few times. These old filling stations were awesome, actually very close to the road sometimes. And, we're talking about small underground tanks back then, and the roads were smaller and maybe not even paved. As things developed, the roads were paved, they got larger. The road may have been widened right above one of these gas tanks. So it's not even on the property anymore. Now it's under the road where it might be more difficult to find it. And then sometimes you just have no idea where to start. Your only indication that there may be a tank at the site is maybe a registration or an invoice associated with the site that you found in our EDMS system, but there's no map. There's no other information about exactly where on the site they could be. Also, just during phase one, during former employee interviews or kind of just word of mouth, somebody might mention, oh yeah, we had a, dispenser where we filled equipment over there, but they don't remember if it was a UST associated with it and where that could be. So you kind of have all these questions. So there are a few things out there that can help you locate tanks without having to dig up the entire site. The most widely used and in ideal conditions, a very useful tool, is the ground penetrating radar. I have a picture of the equipment that's used up in the upper right hand. It's fairly simple, non-intrusive. The GPR uses high frequency electromagnetic waves, just radar, to acquire subsurface information. So the machines just consist of an emitting antenna and then a receiving antenna. And then there's a readout at the top. And pretty much you just transverse your site back and forth, and you're looking at that readout to kind of find indications of tanks or maybe disturbed soil or something. I have a picture right here. This is kind of like an ideal, perfect condition picture of what, if you found tanks, what it would look like. And I'll talk about that a little later. Sometimes it's not always that clear. So I'm not going to really get into the technology of it. I kind of just wanted to make you aware of it. But if you want more info, ClueIn has a section on it with a lot of information, and I'll put the link down here. ASTM also has a recent standard on using GPR, so that's available. So like I said, GPR is a great tool. However, it does have some limitations that need to be considered in determining if it would be helpful at a particular site. One of these is high moisture content of soils. If you have that, if the moisture increases conductivity, so the signal from the equipment will bounce right back out of that instead of reaching down deeper into what you're trying to hit. Clay soils, they can also cause some interference, cause clutter. Of course, other, solid objects, buried scrap metal, cables, piping, concrete with rebar, all these can cause interference and clutter in your readout. Another thing, the machine must be able to make steady contact with the earth. So if you have rough terrain or heavy vegetation, standing water, anything that might mess with that contact that can cause interference and issues. Another thing, success of this is really dependent on the qualifications of the personnel conducting it or interpreting the results. If you decide to do this, whatever company you use, definitely ask who will be conducting it, who will be looking at results, you know, what specialized training do they have and what experience do they have. You want to make sure it's a lot to be able to read these, to kind of see what the little bumps mean and everything. All right, so just have a couple examples I was going to show real quick of sites I've worked at where GPR was used. This is a Brownfield site in Baton Rouge. I think the only indications that there was a tank, if you kind of look back by the fence, kind of where the dashed line goes, there was a raised concrete slab and some bollards with some piping. So it kind of seemed like there was a dispenser there at one point. And then near by the square, we had one little pipe with a cap on it that could be a fill pipe. So we weren't entirely sure, so we did a GPR survey, and the white marking is actually, they marked that out as they did the survey, and we found clear indication of a tank and as well indications of the piping that led back to the dispenser. So we went ahead and got our removal contractor and scheduled the removal, and sure enough, we found the tank. Everything was pretty spot on. We had thought the tank was kind of oriented perpendicular to the road with the long side. And then when we started digging, it ended up being more parallel. So we dug a little bit more on the far side just to make sure we weren't missing anything, but there was nothing else there. So, but really good tool. We were able to find it, confirmed it in order to schedule the removal. So another site, this one was a little bit more difficult. This is in Westwego. This was a gas station on the northwest side since the 1950s until early 1990s. The eastern portion had been used for different things, including a restaurant, a grocery store, and also an auto repair shop at one time. So indications of potential USTs at the site included some obvious ones. I think there were 3 fill ports. We also had the concrete curbing and things indicative of former fuel dispensers. EDMS record search actually identified a registration form that showed 4 USTs. However, in talking to people and rumors about town were that there could potentially have been more older USTs there that were never registered, that had been, you know, quit being used as these newer ones had come into play. So we weren't sure. So we decided to do a GPR survey to determine this. And these were our results. The only anomalies they actually found that it turned up were this little larger, more solid blue area, which just appeared to have been a previously excavated area. It was just an area of disturbed soil. And then up to the north with the stripes, that was just an area that seemed to be indicative of a tank pit. The soil type was different. It seemed to be like it was more sandy, and so it could have been a former pit. So based on the presence of the fill ports that were still there, we were a bit skeptical of the GPR findings. So we went ahead and did a little bit of probing, kind of in a grid basis like this, just to see if we would hit anything, see if anything was down there. And based on our probing results, we did find potentially 7 USTs that may have been there. Two groupings, one with 2, one with what we thought was 4, and then down kind of to the southeast, a little lone UST. Well, when we actually went to remove the tanks, we did find 4, as the registration said. They were in kind of the areas that the probing showed. The little lone tank that we found to the southeast actually ended up being just kind of a holding tank or sump that was associated, we think, with the old septic system. So not a fuel UST. Looking back at, especially with what we knew about the site now and the trying to find, what went wrong with the GPR, thinking it could have been a couple of things. The soil at this site was very clay, so it could have been causing some interference. I believe the concrete was also very thick and had rebar in it. So that might have also been kind of clouding and causing interference that wasn't allowing the GPR to actually bounce the signal off the tanks. So you just have to kind of think about that, and even if you get the results, kind of decide, oh, maybe do we need to do more? All right, so just a couple of other things you may want to consider too if you have a UST site and you're going to remove it. Watch the weather. If you're gonna, when you're scheduling your removal, especially if it may take a few days between excavation and filling it back in. You don't want a huge rainstorm. If you get water in the excavation, especially if there is contamination in there, you may either have to get a permit or pump out the water and bring it to a disposal facility if you need to remove it to put the fill back in. Also, and this is mostly for brownfield funded projects, QA/QC samples. I don't believe they are required under the UST closure guidance. However, they would likely be a part of any EPA approved quality assurance project plan you have. So make sure that you let your UST removal company know this, that they will need to, for the confirmatory samples, they will need to collect quality assurance samples, such as field duplicates, rinse blanks, trip blanks, field blanks. I would just provide them with a copy of the quality assurance project plan, just so they're aware. Okay, I told you it was quick. So that's all I have. If you do have any questions, here's my contact information, and feel free to give me a call or email. Thanks.
All right, great, Jennifer. Thank you for giving us some information about addressing USTs at brownfield sites. I'm going to bring up, hopefully, the contact information for all of our speakers today. Hopefully that's on your screen now. Just again, note for Sam's email address, use Samuel Broussard, because there is another Sam Broussard with sambroussard@la.gov, and that will go to DOTD instead of Sam at DEQ. So if you do have any other questions, feel free to raise your hand at this time or type them into the Q&A box. While we're waiting for those to come in, I have a quick question for Tad. So you talked about how DEQ might put a lien or would put a lien on a property. What are the ways that people can get that lien removed? Is that something that a prospective purchaser can pay off? Is that something that might be negotiable? How does that work?
Okay, well, yes, it is negotiable. They have options. Obviously, the property owner can pay off the lien, gradually pay off the lien. It can be paid off through a purchase. Prospective buyer would obviously purchase the property from the owner and the amount of the lien would be remitted to the department to clear the lien. If the lien amount happens to be more than the market value, I believe the department would probably negotiate for that market value amount and clear the lien. So those are some options to remove the lien from the property.
Great. And Jennifer, there's a question that came through. Are there certified contractors for ground penetrating radar? So is there some type of certification process for that?
I am not aware of any that's out there. I was, at least the last time I looked into it, which has only probably been a couple of years. I don't think there was anything. I know there's some classes and certification. Like when I was kind of doing a little research for this, I was surprised to find that ASTM standard. So that is something I can look into more a little bit and let everyone know. But to my knowledge right now, there is not.
Yeah, I'm not aware of anything for that either, but I thought your suggestions on making sure that you know exactly who's going to be using the equipment, analyzing the results, and check out their experience with it, that's a really good suggestion.
Right, yeah, especially just because they have someone specialized in it, make sure that person is going to be doing it.
Mm-hmm. And I will say it is not unusual to find an underground storage tank at a brownfield site. Referring back to an earlier question about that asked about a database of sites, one really great resource for finding underground storage tanks is Sanborn maps. And there is the opportunity, if you're applying for assessment grant, I believe that you can include some inventorying activities as part of your assessment grant, including doing a Sanborn map search for a corridor that might be able to help you identify old underground storage tanks that might not be in LDEQ system. That can help you develop your inventory of sites, looking for those old tanks on Sanborn maps. And a lot of the libraries now actually have those available for free. So you can also look at it that way if you don't have an assessment grant yet, but wanted to look at a particular area. All right, well, it looks like we do not have any other questions coming in, and we're a little bit past 4 o'clock. So I want to thank again our speakers today. Really appreciate you taking the time to tell us about the different resources that are out there to address underground storage tanks at brownfield sites. Again, this is just the beginning of the conversation, so be sure to follow up with us if you have any additional questions. We're here to help you get those tanks removed or addressed in order to help get your brownfield sites back into reuse. So thank you again for joining us, and follow up if you have any additional questions.